It's my privilege to call this meeting to order. My name is Fred Finn, and I have the task and the very great pleasure of presenting our speakers. First of all, I tell you that we have a few problems that hopefully will be resolved as the program gets started. Frankly, I'm very nervous. It's been several years since I've been involved in one of these national meetings. I feel a little bit like the new priest who was about to say his first Mass. And he asked the old pastor what he should do, and the old priest suggested that before he went out of the sacristy, he put a little gin or vodka in the water, and that would help to relax him. The next Sunday, the new priest filled his water glass with gin, and he talked up a storm. And after the Mass, he very courageously went to the old priest and asked him how he did, and the old priest said, "You were relaxed enough, all right. However, there are a few things that have to get straightened out. First of all, there are 10 commandments, not 12, and there were 12 apostles, not 10. David slew Goliath. He didn't beat the hell out of him. We do not refer to Jesus Christ as the late J.C. Next Sunday, there's a taffy pulling contest at St. Peter's, not a Peter pulling contest at St. Taffy's. And we don't refer to the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost as Big Daddy Jr. and the Spook. I don't understand the reason for putting our main speaker between Finn and O'Brien, but I never question the wisdom of those who manage such affairs. Someone said it had something to do with Chicago and Daly and so on. And so Mr. O'Brien will react to the presentation, and I'll tell you more about him later. My problem in presenting an appropriate introduction for our speaker this evening is similar to the one that was frequently encountered by the great King Solomon. You know, he had a tremendous harem. And his problem was that each time he visited his harem, he knew what he wanted to do, but he didn't know where to begin. And so I'm going to begin at the beginning and tell you that our speaker was born in Mannheim, Germany. He became a U.S. citizen in 1956. He's married and the father of 2 daughters, Margaret and Joan, and 1 son, Paul. And the family is currently residing in Syracuse. He earned his bachelor's degree in Memphis, Tennessee, his master's degree at St. Louis University in Missouri, and his doctorate, a Ph.D., from George Peabody College in Nashville, Tennessee. He's worked as a laboratory technician, a research clerk, a clinical assistant in psychology. He served as a staff psychologist at the Miskatatuck State School in Indiana, as chief psychologist and director of human development at the Green Valley Hospital in Tennessee, as director of research and training at the Plymouth State Home and Training School in Michigan. From 1964 to 1971, he served as mental retardation research scientist at the Nebraska Psychiatric Institute at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. And from 1971 to 1973, he held the title of visiting scholar at the National Institute on Mental Retardation in Toronto, Canada. In September of 1973, he was appointed professor in the Division of Special Education and Rehabilitation at the University of Syracuse, and he continues in that position up until the present time. He has the honor of being a fellow in the American Association on Mental Deficiency, the American Psychological Association, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's a member of the Council for Exceptional Children, the National Association for Retarded Children, the American Association of University Professors, and many, many other professional organizations. Our speaker is a prolific writer. He has over 150 published works to his credit. The list is far too long to enumerate. His articles appear regularly in virtually every major professional journal, and his books are studied by students across the land. Much of his writing has been translated into French, Swedish, Danish, and German, and he is widely read in those countries. He served on a variety of state-level and national committees, these committees having been organized to promote the welfare of handicapped citizens. and as you might suspect, he became deeply involved in these many and varied activities. It is this deep involvement and the genuine concern for the welfare of handicapped individuals that has caused him to seek out better ways for providing for their needs. He's not satisfied with the status quo. He raises questions and he advocates solutions, and these solutions aren't always acceptable to the decision makers. He provokes action and reaction and is often in the center of controversy. Our speaker has been characterized as an angry, outraged young man by some, a perfectionist by others, and as an eminent scientist by most. And they believe that he has made a substantial contribution to the field of mental retardation and other services to handicapped people. Whether or not you agree with all of his recommendations for change should not detract from your realization that many, many handicapped people have benefited and are living greatly enriched lives because of his involvement, and all of us should be thankful for the fact that he so chose. The other side of the man that so few of you know, he's a member of the U.S. Chess Federation with the rating of U.S. Chess Expert. He's a stamp collector, a collector of old and historic texts in psychology and mental retardation. He enjoys hiking, and he's very active in conservation groups such as the Defenders of Wildlife, the Sierra Club, and other organizations which are concerned with historic preservation and the conservation of our natural resources. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great privilege to present to you Dr. Wolfensberger.
Fred Finn has confessed to you that he has had some anxieties, and I also have to confess to you that I feel very uncomfortable and stressed about this presentation tonight. My major message tonight is one that revolves around life or death, and in fact more death than life. And the death that I'm referring to is that which I happen to see ahead for our severely retarded brothers and sisters. The first time I tried to project the future in mental retardation was at our AAMD convention in 1969 in Miami. Many of the forecasts which I attempted at that time have materialized, such as greater integration, deinstitutionalization, extension of rights, decline in the incidence of severe handicap, and so on. However, I had failed to forecast many of the perversions that have accompanied these trends, such as mindless mainstreaming, dumping, the inabilities of implementive structures to fulfill legal and litigative mandates, and so on. For some of the other predictions, which I ventured in 1969, 7 years has not proven to be enough time to pronounce them valid or invalid. But generally, my forecasts were optimistic, and you might say they were somewhat of the Hermann Kahn type. But now in 1976, I not only read new signs, but I also read new meaning into old signs. And I must predict a bit more along the lines of the Club of Rome. Briefly, I do continue to see considerable improvements in the future for less retarded people. But for less retarded people, I emphasize that, because that often gets lost. But I now see, hear, taste, and smell doom and destruction for severely impaired people. Not only, of course, severely impaired retarded people, but also the elderly, the newborn, perhaps other groups, such as the severely ill or physically handicapped. I will try to unfold slowly and somewhat roundabout the reasons for this dire vision. What happens to people is determined by, at least one can view them as being determined by two classes of phenomena. One class is in the domain of natural events over which mankind has little control, such as cosmic events, changes in the sun, the rotation of the earth, the seasons, earthquakes, and so on. And secondly, there are social events which are more variable, which are not inevitable, which occur in a time continuum of human choices and human behaviors. Even if we look at the larger physical world, we will not understand it too well unless we come to understand its past. Without understanding its past, it is almost impossible to predict its future. And human events are similar. Those who know the past are exceedingly well armed. Past becomes future and vice versa in an instant, in a flash. And there really is no present time. The present is largely a verbal image that serves communication purposes, but it has very little reality. Thus, at least in part, and at least dimly, we can see our future in our past. One of the most stable bases of human behavior and of human choice, especially across groups and populations, are human values. And this is why I believe that of the many ways of forecasting, the assessment of value trends and their implications is one of the most powerful. And that was the method that I did utilize 7 years ago in trying to assess what current American value trends were and what direction they were traveling into, what their dynamics were, and what the logical consequences of some of these values would be. Now, if we utilize this method, and there are many methods of forecasting. This is merely one, but perhaps one of the most powerful ones when it comes to predicting patterns of human behavior. Here we can look both at larger, universal socio-historical values, as well as more specific, culturally fixated ones. In our instance, we can perhaps look both at universal values across the world and across the ages as it has come to us through history, as well as the values in the more specific North American context. First, let us look at the more universal picture as far as mentally retarded people are concerned. Now here, a look at history, of which we're getting so much at this convention with excellent visual presentations and so on. History reveals to us that mental retardation is one of the human conditions that has never been valued, with possibly one exception, which may be a modest and only partial exception. And the exception is that in some cultures, at some times, some retarded people have been viewed as associated with a sacred spirit, as being imbued with a sacred spirit, as representing a sacred entity, and so on. If people did not believe in sacred spirits, or did not see the retarded as imbued with a sacred spirit, or as speaking for one, or equivalent to one, and so on, then they were not valued, or at the very least, their condition was not valued, or was not envied. This is why Mohammedanism has appeared to have dealt relatively kindly with retarded people, because the retarded person was called a marabut, or saint, the same word that might be applied to a saintly, aesthetic, revered person. However, even Christianity, which has dealt more positively with the mentally retarded than many religions, has shown deep ambivalences. Some retarded people have been seen within the historical tradition, at least associated with Christian societies, as possessed by demonic spirits. Some were seen as changelings without any soul at all. Many were brutalized and rejected despite existing positive theological precepts, which may have been taught but were not internalized and practiced by the people. Many retarded people were accepted and even loved, but often then in a patronizing fashion, which still shouted out loudly, "How fortunate I am to be better than these." The evidence of history thus suggests that hardly any mother will ever cry out in joy and say, "Look what I've done, I've born a retarded child." This is very unlikely to happen. Nor is it likely that too many people will ever wish that they were retarded themselves. Aside from this human universal, let us look specifically at some value currents and dynamics of North American society, though there are also found parallels, very close parallels, in other and especially other Western societies. One way of predicting the future within a culture is to look at the commonalities and social institutions which hold the culture together and which are largely an expression of other underlying values. And I call these the glues of a culture. And here you see projected some of the major typical glues, the glues which are relevant not just to our culture, because other cultures are held together by the same glues, but they take different form in different cultures. Many of our cultural glues have taken hundreds and even thousands of years to build. And yet I submit to you that these glues are coming apart all over the Western world at least, and they're coming apart at an unbelievable speed. They're coming unstuck in good part because of the decline in some of the traditional values, some of the traditional overarching systems of common core values, and the rise of other values, and particularly one other value which is truly overarching today, and that is hedonism. And hedonism is indeed beginning to be the glue that is holding our society together, but I submit to you that it is a very self-destructive and self-limiting kind of glue. I will come back to what I mean by hedonism and its various components and implications later on, because apparently I use the term in a fashion which some people find idiosyncratic, and we do need to examine it very closely. Now, if we look at the various glues projected here, I could go for hours reciting evidence how almost every one of these is coming unstuck. Some only a little, some almost entirely. But time will only permit a summarization. If we look at the positive feelings which citizens are prepared to have for each other, here we can go down to trust as well. We're seeing all sorts of evidence that distrust is rising, even the rise in interpersonal aggression and violence that I will come back to later, that people do not trust each other, that people lock themselves up. You see chains and locks and keys and guards. We now see armed guards standing in front of our schools because we can no longer control our schools. Many social role expectancies are coming apart. Expectancies about the role of the elderly. We have extruded the elderly and are extruding the elderly from our society. We see a loss of the wisdom of the elderly. There is an adult loss of authority and control over their children due to changing, in part due to changing role expectancies. Children know more than they've ever known before, but have fewer limits set in their lives. The change in sex roles and expectancies, moving toward equality, also moves us to some degree toward a decreased ability to love one another and to form long-lasting bonds. The family is dissolving, in part as a result of role expectancy changes, and this dissolution continues to increase. The rate is now approximately 4 per 1,000 marriages per year, which is a phenomenally high rate when you consider that it affects only adults, that it affects 2 persons at a time, that this is only for 1 year, and so on. There are changes in education. In fact, the educational breakdowns that we are experiencing. We may controvert about whether the decline in basic achievement in our children is an artifact or not, whether it is a decline in disciplinary control and self-control. We can debate it. But what is not so debatable are some facts, such that there are more than 100 murders committed in schools per year, approximately 70,000 assaults on teachers, many involving rape and attempted rape, school vandalism costing $500 million a year, and on and on. And while the schools in the poorest parts of town may have the highest delinquency rates, the second highest delinquency rates are often found in the most favored schools in the suburbs. Universities are not exempt. An incredible extent of vandalism. Universities surrender control and lack of will, an erosion of scholarization and standards, anything to please and attract and keep students. University faculty, for the first time that I know of in the history of formal education, is imitating the students instead of the students imitating their teachers. That has never happened before. And I'm referring to the changes in lifestyle, in grooming. It was not the professors started growing the beards. The professors started growing the beards when the students grew beards, and the professors wanted to keep up with the students. Changes in religion and churches, a steady decline of practically all indices of membership, of attendance, of faith and belief. Ethnicity and tribalism may hold a society together or may divide it, depending. And we have seen a growth of separatist militancy in many groups in our society. A decline in patriotism, which may be good for world peace, but nevertheless it does signal a lowered internal cohesion. A collapse of government, citizens going bankrupt, crime-ridden, congested, dirty, county governments corrupt, national governments in a state of collapse of immorality. Many state governments are corrupt or at least non-functional. New York is a classical example, and so is the state in which we're in right now. Federal government now has 2.7 million civilian employees, 13% of them with graduate education, with ever-decreasing effectiveness and outcome. The Department of Agriculture alone has one employee for every 27 farmers. But it managed to bring on a soybean shortage and an inflationary wheat sale to Russia. And we can go on and on and on. Political parties, in good part, non-functional. They cannot produce leaders. The lowest common denominator determines who will lead us. The person who has no enemies gets appointed president. And no citizen is immune from spying, as recent reports have shown. Corruption on a presidential level. The parties of our democratic system are non-democratic in their functioning. Communication. New tongues proliferate. The speech of the young, the speech of different professions and vocations, the pilots, the police, the speech in mental health that people can no longer understand, of minority groups, and on and on. The telephone is still working. Travel is a mixed situation. We have a rail breakdown in many of sorts. The automobile is probably about to break down as an adaptive medium. Air, well, we're flying, and yet we have to go through armed guards and body searches because a small group, 100 people, have disabled the entire system. Commerce and trade, again, corruption. Paradoxes. How can we have both inflation and high unemployment? And the economists still have not really found the answer. And morality in business is atrocious, from the philandering salesman all the way to the corporate president. The United States is the biggest exporter of torture equipment in the world. Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist, has a similar formulation. He says that human culture is composed of three basic exchange systems: those for knowledge, those for affiliation and affection, and those for goods and services. And most of these glues fall into these three categories, and most of these glues are profoundly jeopardized. Let's come back to hedonism, which is supposed to explain much of what I'm trying to say and why things are coming unglued. Hedonism I see as being composed in its recent Western form of 4 components. And I'm sorry we cannot improve on the projectors. There are some problems, and that's the best pretty much that we can do, and have to ask your forbearance. Materialism, the preoccupation with wealth, possessions, goods, property, quantity and variety thereof, and so on. And sadly, while many young people have turned away, while many people, especially young people, are turning away from materialism, often, unfortunately, they're turning increasingly to sensualism. Sensualism, of course, is the indulgence, sensory pleasures, bodily pleasures, preoccupation with comforts and convenience, the body, youth, beauty, sex, thrills, speed, travel, and things of this nature. And externalism, because of sensualism, because of having been given all one desires, never had rational limits set consistently, never had to overcome adversity, only having to overcome inconsistent resistance and demands for more. Our children do not have identities and internal strengths because of these inconsistencies, these irrationalities in their rearing. And we run across peculiar justifications and acknowledgments and rationalizations of this type of externalism. For instance, recently I ran across a book review, and I took a quote that says, "The speed of movement in therapy depends on the willingness and or ability of the parents to readjust the family to fit in with the child's wishes." Contrast a statement such as that with perhaps statements such as let us help the child to relate to the demands of society, teach the child internal controls and structures and so on. No, the family must adjust to the child's wishes. And that book got the Book of the Year award, this particular organization and group. So our people often now lack internal strengths. Many young people do not even have the ability to carry through one single day of hard physical labor. And lacking deep personal strengths, convictions, morality, they accept external reference and supports, the peer culture, the media, fads, and customs. And I ran across a clipping here from Ann Landers, and I will read it to you. "Dear Ann Landers, here I am, like so many others. After having composed hundreds of letters to Ann Landers in my head, I'm finally putting one down on paper. I'm a wife, 26 years old, who's deeply troubled about the place of fidelity in marriage. A few months ago, I discovered that my husband was unfaithful. Not a week goes by that I don't hear about another couple in our crowd who's cheating. It's him, her, or both. Almost every time my husband and I go out for an evening, we run into a man we know who is not with his wife, or a woman who is not with her husband."
At this point, please stop your machine and turn your cassette over.
Since the unfortunate episode occurred in our own marriage, my husband has told me he is very sorry for the hurt he caused me, but he let me know that he doesn't feel he committed such a terrible offense. I'm very confused. I want to be fair and open-minded. Of course, that's very important, to be fair and open-minded. I want to be fair and open-minded, yet I cannot accept this new lifestyle, this new style designed for living. Will you please tell me if in the year 1975 faithfulness to one's spouse is out of date? Whatever your answer, I do not intend to leave my husband. I love him very much. We've had 8 happy years together, and I want many more. My faith has been badly shaken. How wrong is it if most couples do it? please help me sort things out. Signed, Uncertain. At one time, we went to Moses in the mountain, to the prophets, to the temples, to the forehead of Zeus, to the oracle of Delphi. Today, we go to Ann Landers, who just had her own divorce. In a book entitled Society Without the Father, Alexander Mitscherlich points to the anonymous nature of almost all societal processes and decisions today, due to the decline in authority, and due to the decline in authority figures and the decline in belief in authority and authority figures. How can there be identity if there is no one to identify with, he said. And recently a reporter traveled coast to coast and asked people, who are the greatest living Americans? And got no answers. No, people could not give him any names. And that is the first time in our history that has happened. A plastic society, Mitscherlich says, it's no longer kill dad, because there isn't any more dad. And so it becomes just plain kill, which means kill society and anarchy. And I saw the sign in the university, one of the most beautiful universities in North America, in paint, scrawled against the wall, spray paint, which is very easy and hedonistic, and it said, create anarchy. And I thought to myself, now that's a new one on me. It used to be just, let's make anarchy. But you see, we'll come down to individualism. Somebody else's anarchy is no longer good enough for me. I must create my own. And that explains some of the alienation that we see, the random rage of many people, the phony revolutionarism of some people, the mass terror, the Patty Hearsts, the moon children, the children who grow up in empty families and grow up as empty shells and are grabbed by a cult and brainwashed, and they're very radical, and the parents send out detectives, grab them and re-brainwash, and they're totally what they were before again. It comes, it goes, it's programmed in, it's programmed out, which is easy because there's nothing in there. And you can program it in and you can program it out. And so we get, if we could have that overlay, yeah, Chris. So we get from sensualism and from externalism, the reliance on the external supports, drugs, nicotine, coffee, and alcohol, cannabis, and heroin, which is bound to increase as long as externalism continues to increase, and when people have nothing inside to sustain them. The fourth horseman of hedonism, you might say, is individualism. Self-actualization, self-fulfillment, all the beautiful words, all the things that we say we want, self-differentiation, creativity, expressivity, who am I? That's individualism, and it's good, but, yes, it's good, but up to a point, up to a point. There are 5 roots of individualism, and I will not run through these. These are strong historical roots. We have the mystic tradition, medieval scholasticism, the romantic tradition of individualism, the egotistic one of Hobbes, Nietzsche, and Freud, and social Darwinism. We have ideological academicism, unbridled inquiry, you know. But again, it's an ideal, and yet it has dangers. And we have alienated individualism. And what it adds up to, at a certain point, individualism becomes self-fulfillment regardless of cost to others or to society. Because I am supreme. My individualization takes supremacy over anybody else's. Back to hedonism, which is a combination of several or all of these 4. The gospel of hedonism preaches that anything that creates discomfort is evil and should be eliminated or avoided. So we withdraw, for example, from the demands of child rearing. Child rearing is hard. It's very difficult and demanding. Years of relentless, unceasing effort. So we withdraw from that and we get disordered children. Vast numbers and proportions of disordered children. And we avoid the painful reality of what causes such disorder by blaming the victim. And we say the child has, and we begin to label minimal cerebral dysfunction or whatever. We put the child on drugs. So labeling and drugging solves our responsibility in the pain of confronting reality. Any inconvenience in marriage? Let's try another partner. It's easy. The aged, they smell of death and decay. Push them into outer darkness. Early this year, I looked at the bestseller list of non-fiction books, and among the top 9, I found Winning Through Intimidation, The Power Lovers, The Money Book, Relaxation Response, and Crazy Salad. These were 5 of the 9 bestsellers among non-fiction books early this year. And indeed, as with any value-based phenomenon, and these are value-based, we can now see scientists rushing in, not distinguishing between value and empiricism, and trying to prove to us scientifically that hedonism is good science, that it is proven by science to be good for us. And here, a forceful rationale for and scientificated synthesis of hedonism was provided by Prescott, who saw the violence that we are experiencing in our culture today as seen not as being caused as a result of hedonism, but as the result of not enough hedonism, as the result of lack of bodily, and as he calls it, somatosensory pleasure during the formative periods of life. And as a remedy, the author advocates not merely that infants be fondled more, not merely that their needs be met immediately and consistently once more, on demand, as the other writer. He also calls for general acceptance of nudity, of premarital and extramarital sex, as well as an end to the values of monogamy, chastity, and virginity. Another classical example of scientificated abdication of child-rearing responsibilities is contained in an announcement in the 1975 issue of Mental Hygiene News of a workshop entitled Learning to Live with Your Children. You learn to live with a child, not the child learning to live with society. Again, I could cite evidence for hours of the ubiquity of hedonism and its message in our culture, but obviously I cannot do so. It is true, though, that many messages in our social environment can be seen with much higher consciousness in a new light as being disguised, undisguised, confessed or unconfessed exhortations to surrender to hedonism. We see it in the message of the what, the glorification of the food, the drink, beauty, drugs, money, housing, transportation, youth, and publicity. We are the house of custom, modeling, peer pressures, law even, in the media and everywhere. One important consequence of hedonism is that pleasure replaces love, and short-term and individualistic advantages or benefits replace long-term and or societal and systemic benefits. And that in part explains the collapse of the family. We no longer speak of love and marriage, but we speak of the pleasure bond. There's the book of Masters and Johnson's. That's the name of it. And finally, again, it had to happen, as indicated before, that not only ideology but also science proves to us that marriage and such bonds should not last. And so contemporary books abound with various titles that scream this message. As one thinker has recently formulated systematically what some people have been trying to say less articulately, namely that the traditional dyadic marriage is, quotes, an embodiment of selfish individualism. A reversal of interpretation here. It puts down the individual. It is not able to open up the individual. Whereas all sorts of group marriages are, quotes, committed to growth, quotes, committed to autonomy, quotes, afford pluralism of lifestyles, quote, yield personal freedom. Interestingly, all the arguments which formerly were advanced on behalf of marriage are now advanced on behalf of the dissolution of traditional bonds. But while the sophisticated are busily scientificating hedonism, the artist, as always in all cultures and ages practically, sees with an inner eye the realities and presents it to us in imagery and art and lampoons the sophisticated reification of our scientists. And, for example, this cartoon that I found, where the little boy says to Santa Claus, I want to find transcendental enlightenment of my subconscious inner soul. I want to experience the full meaning of inner bliss and spiritual fulfillment. I want to be eternally blessed with total self-satisfaction. In other words, lay a train on me, Pops. Persons engulfed in and by hedonism will find themselves confronted eventually by a number of societal and personal systems, personal states and phenomena. Anomie, boredom. When you have done everything and you're still bored. And so the young people who have everything say, there's nothing to do. They say that constantly. And they have everything. And there's a loss of internal control. I've mentioned the surrender to drugs, to irrationality, where one disables other systems because one feels inconvenienced. And if I can't function as I want to, then I make sure that nothing else functions. And much of what I see in society happening today, I call systems disablement. All the dysfunctionalities that bring the whole operation to a collapse. Delinquency and lawlessness. Violence. Most Americans want a quick fix of violence 5 nights a week, the TV surveys show us. By the time the average American child graduates from high school, he or she will have seen on television 18,000 murders. One violent act is depicted every minute in television cartoons for children. On the average, 6 times more violence during an hour of children's television than in an hour of adult programming. A university professor got banned from speaking to the students when he tried to run 2 courses that he called Orgasm 1 and Orgasm 2. And they were actually about literature. And he got banned and said bitterly, had I offered Violence 1 and Violence 2, there would have been no controversy. And this has deep implications to mental retardation, as I will explain later, because it helps pave the way for disciplined, legalized, and surgically aseptic violence. And we get violence that is not only lawless, but also lawful. The Attica murders, the Kent State infanticides, as one could almost call it. We see the de-individualism, the de-individualization, which oddly enough, paradoxically, is the result of striving for individualism that is not fully fulfillable. Family discontinuity, mental disorder, and suicide. A particularly striking manifestation of hedonism is the fact that human shortcomings, failures, offenses, and outright disasters are being reinterpreted as desirable, as beneficial, as moral, and as glorious. At one time, we overlooked human shortcomings, or we forgave them, or we denied them shamefully, or we hid them, or we acknowledge them with a wink as wrong but not fully capable of avoiding them. Today we glorify them. We raise them up to the ideal to be aspired to, at least, if not the ideal, and at least the routine norm. This type of reification can be found all around us. In California, a former brothel madam ran unsuccessfully for mayor 4 times. She was only elected this year after she confessed to her real identity. A recent article in The Futurist spelled out all sorts of reasons why people should gamble. It increases efficiency, stimulates mentality, offers hope, allows decision-making, mediates peak experiences, and enables people to face daily life. And interestingly, a large portion of the article was devoted to the desirability of gambling for elderly people, especially elderly people in nursing homes. To me, there are many messages here, not the least of which is that if the unbelievable and genuinely unbelievable quantity of tranquilizers and mood-altering drugs that are being used against elderly people and in nursing homes, if they don't work in denying reality, maybe gambling will. The highest officials of Lockheed deny that their worldwide bribery and corruption at the expense of the American taxpayer is in any way immoral, because after all, we're only doing what everybody else is doing. And again, we could go on and on. This type of reinterpretation, this type of reification is not merely just an interesting fact, and it is not merely evidence of changes in values. It is much more. it is a danger flag to us to be on the lookout for the perversion of language that lies ahead that will be used to rationalize the destruction of human life. Each age has its own babble, its confusion of tongues, its verbal prisons, its perversions of language. And I believe that we are presently experiencing an increasing confusion of tongues beyond any previous level in North American society. I will control myself here and not even get into the issue of the implications of Western hedonism to the larger world scene, although I do see the makings of world disaster in the impending confrontation between the rich Western nations and the poor nations who possess little except nuclear weapons. Will they starve to death quietly? Let us instead focus on why the issue of hedonism is so critical to human services. It is because the issue of hedonism will determine how society will respond to the elderly, to the poor, to the handicapped, to the mentally retarded, the mentally disordered, to legal offenders and prisoners, to ethnic and racial minorities, to the sick and to the dying. And here it is essential to be aware that there is a totally logical and unfortunately almost natural continuum to the process of devaluation. Devaluation cannot exist as a static phenomenon. It must go forward or backward. First, it tends to lead to labeling. Once devaluation gets started, the next stage, logically, is to label it. And then, number 3, labeled devaluation almost irresistibly urges toward segregation or selection of the devalued person or group. And then, fourthly, segregation is accompanied by the scaring off of other people. You've devalued, you've labeled, you've segregated, and now you scare off. You may scare off with additional labeling, with the way perhaps that segregation is carried out, with symbols and so on. And then fifthly, in the presence of certain other conditions, segregation will urge toward what I call death-making or destruction. And these conditions that may make for death-making, and I use the word death-making, I borrow that from Robert Merton. He speaks of death-forging, the making of death. When the devaluation that led to segregation was strongly associated with hostility initially, then it may lead to death-making, because hostility is the capital investment of aggression. Or when resources run short, societal resources, when there are other social stresses, and society needs focused targets of hostility and aggression. When value-sustaining value systems disintegrate, when personal internal controls disintegrate, then you get death-making. First comes death-making 1. And that is societal systems that forge death in systematic but still disguised and unrecognized fashion. We have found it in structures such as mandatory retirement of elderly people, which is destructive and yet which is constitutionally upheld. Debilitating overprotection of handicapped people, psychosocial isolation, nursing homes, breaking the will and the motive to live, or, and most subtly of all perhaps, the juxtaposition of a group of people, devalued people, with death imagery and death symbols. Have you ever noticed how the evil character or the criminal offender in cartoons is always depicted as ugly and often even as handicapped? I found in Time magazine a picture of one of the earliest depictions of the witch in Hansel and Gretel. The witch is old, the witch is obese, the witch is ugly, the witch has a wart on her nose, and the witch walks with 2 crutches. Why are witches not beautiful and young? Dick Tracy, the evil character, more often than not, is really a handicapped character. Eyeless, and all sorts of cosmetic and other handicaps. And he is, or she is, the evil character. Have you noticed how old people are almost always depicted as ugly and often as handicapped. We had a conference in Syracuse, problems of the Jewish elderly, and a mask of terror looks out at us, depicting, come to this conference, and that is elderly people. And a week later, the Gentiles had their conference. And it was, if anything, even worse. And that was staged by the Gerontology Center. And the old woman she's even malformed. Her little finger is her longest finger. And so she is ugly and handicapped and doesn't even look human with non-human hands. We depict elderly people as senile in their second childhood, as dependent. An old woman with a doll. We depict them as ugly in cartoons and humor. Turtles can live to age 75 without becoming senile. The doctor put you on turtle soup diet. And there's an old man, again, an ugly face, in a wheelchair. That's aging. And even when elderly people participate in valued activities and social action, still the image is not a favorable one. Rare is an image that I found, and I almost shot out of bed when I saw it. And I realized for the first time in my life I had seen an elderly person presented in order to sell a piece of clothing. I had never seen it before in my life until a few months ago. I never knew I hadn't seen it. That is how unconscious it is. Clothes are sold with young adults, and only young adults. Mature clothes for adults are sold via young adults. Innumerable services for the elderly have names that suggest death, such as Carefree, Golden Gate, Threshold, Sunset, Park Lawn, Keeling Personal Care Home, like keeling over dead, Freezer's Home for the aged, for the stiffs and colds, Granite Nursing Home for the old fossils, and on and on. In Syracuse, we have, at the least, 3 facilities for elderly people built in cemeteries, 10 built next to cemeteries, 7 next to funeral homes, 1 inside a former funeral home, 1 almost next door to the county coroner, 1 nursing home administrator is an embalmer, 2 facilities are on dead-end streets, 3 are next to garbage dumps. I say that something very powerful and unequivocal is being communicated about older people and aging in Syracuse. But the experts at our $1 million a year gerontology center say it's all a coincidence. I can virtually promise you that if you go home and start looking with a deliberate and conscious eye, you'll be surprised how many coincidences you will find. And again, the artist has had no difficulty seeing them where the experts deny them. The fact that an unbelievably disproportionate number of elderly people can see cemeteries from where they live, whereas most other people it is unusual. Or, again, the artist who is not deceived by our babble of confusion, the Golden Gate, Golden Age, Eventide Home for the Aged and City Dump. And so many facilities have these phony labels and are next to city dumps. And there you see the bodies being brought in by the garbage truck. Another load of old folks. Where do you want them? And the little character says, "You'll like it here, Dad." And if we could have the other overhead back. The next stage, Death Making 2, Death Making 2 is the breaking of the ethical line in a qualitative discontinuity, but under the guise of humanism. And so we see liberalized abortion, withholding treatment for certain groups, euthanasia for the aged and suffering and retarded, malformed newborn infants, and of course let's go to death making. Detoxification I've listed here. Detoxification begins primarily with Death Making 2. It is symbolized only in Death-Making 1. And I will save detoxification for later because it can also be found in Death-Making 3. And finally, of course, Death-Making 3 is openly acknowledged destruction. Many of you must surely view some of my views and fears as far-fetched. Some of you may even believe that active euthanasia for anyone may not even occur, or that you may see the advent of active euthanasia but only for a small number of people or only for the terminally ill. So let me review a few chilling facts that the moral base for a relatively large-scale extermination already exists. Is the legitimization of mass euthanasia really so unthinkable? Well, recall that between 1939 and 1945, 45 million people were slaughtered on command. All you need to do is put a piece of cloth of a particular color on a person and a label that says soldier and say kill, and we will kill. It's amazing what role expectancies will do. Milgram studies of obedience are terrifying. You can grab people off the street in American cities, bring them to a university, stand there in a white coat, and say, push that button. And the person may think that a person is dying as a result of his pushing the button, and may break out in sweat and may protest. But as long as the authority figure says, you must go on, push that button, that citizen will kill. The Kitty Genovese phenomenon, 38 witnesses to murder in New York City, and not a one even as much called the police. And the Manson review of literature, identification of a victim of aggression, actually makes people mad. People don't want to know that people are being aggressed against. And Manson found in a survey that 67% of his sample agreed that there was such a thing as unfit people. And 2/3 agreed that mercy killing of emotionally and mentally unfit was okay, provided it was done scientifically. And the recent Gallup poll revealed that 53% of the American public now supports the active termination of life of incurably ill persons if the person and the family request it. And you all remember the research widely publicized in the New England Journal of Medicine that 14% of 300 infants that died during a 2.5-year period at Yale New Haven Hospital died because treatment was withheld after discovery of an anomaly. Lately, we have witnessed some mysterious deaths, some of them since proven to be murder, in various facilities for devalued and ill people. One well-known episode involved 27 respiratory arrests at the Michigan VA hospital with 11 deaths. And then there was the instance of the New Jersey curare deaths, 11 deaths caused by curare. Time magazine squarely pointed its finger on Dr. X, who since then has been identified and has been indicted, but is still practicing medicine. According to one account, there is even supposed to exist a group called Requiem Associates that will endeavor to put handicapped people to death for a fee. This is I don't know whether that's true or not, but I have read such a report. And finally, I want to present to you the arguments advanced in support of the 1972 and 73 Florida Death with Dignity Bill. The argument went that 1,500 retarded persons in Florida state institutions lead meaningless lives. Remember that phrase. Of the residents in the Orlando institution alone, none have citizenship. And thirdly, they cost the state $4 to $6 billion, 4 to 6 years of the entire Florida state budget. And as a result, a bill was drawn up. When a person is incurably or physically incapacitated, medical treatment can be withheld upon the majority vote of all persons of the first degree of kinship. So the children and the spouse or whoever get together and vote. And if it's 3-2, that's it. If no first-degree kin can be found within 30 days, and the mail doesn't even go that quick, the decision can be made if any 3 physicians can concur, and it passed the lower house. It passed. It did not pass the upper house, but it passed the lower house on a 56-60 vote, and it passed. And here's where detoxification comes in. It passed under the Sunshine Law. I cannot emphasize enough that I am in no way advocating heroic measures to prolong the lives of people who are dying and who are perhaps dying very painfully. I repeat it again. I am not advocating that. In fact, I have instructed my wife and a few close friends that I myself do not wish to be reduced to the functioning of a machine, and that I want to die in serenity and with a clear and undrugged mind. However, I am appalled how many people who want the same thing that I want, such as the Aletheia group, are unaware how all of their words and all of the measures that they're proposing can be and are being used merely as a way station to active euthanasia, or as a way to actually disguise even ongoing euthanasia. And it is very important to learn to recognize the language through which the proponents of euthanasia will attempt to detoxify murder and to moralize their actions. The arguments will fall into four groups, which you see projected on the center screen. Let us look at the first argument. The presentation of euthanasia as love, concern, honesty, mercy, and humanism. The very term death with dignity and being passed by the Sunshine Law already contains this persuasion. The use of the term positive euthanasia when you mean active euthanasia and active destruction. One version of the humanism interpretation will be that death is what the person would be choosing if he or she were only of clear mind. And so we have a book, Freedom to Die. And sometimes this phrase also leads to another phrase that is called suicide by proxy. The brochure of the Euthanasia Educational Council states, society must indicate convincingly that it wants physicians to be humanitarians as well as skilled technicians. And to be a humanitarian means you have a commitment to active euthanasia. It's good science, it's good medicine, it's good humanism. And they even quote Pope Pius XII on pain-killing drugs. And recently we read about an interesting development, namely the design of facilities specifically for dying individuals. The best-known contemporary model is St. Christopher's, opened in London in 1967, which is now being copied. In Montreal, it's being copied in New Haven, Connecticut, in the hospice. Though well-designed and well-intentioned, this development may very well prove to be another phase in the detoxification and legitimization of active death-making. Even in its good intention, the New Haven hospice incorporated many of the ambivalences and distortions of our culture about death. For instance, viewing rooms to visit the corpse are so designed that visitors can approach very slowly through a series of vestibules so that they first can see the body at a great distance and perhaps stay at that great distance or beat a hasty retreat if they do not wish to approach closer. Bodies leave the facility by a back door where funeral homes can call for them in, quotes, death-denying station wagons. Fascinatingly, the hospice was designed to have totally separate staff lounges, dining rooms, and offices, as well as soundproof, glass-domed meditation or screaming rooms to which staff can go if they can no longer bear the presence of dying people. Once more, the stereotype is therefore reinforced that ordinary or sane people cannot be expected to spend even 40 hours a week around dying people without profoundly separating themselves, or perhaps without losing their minds, unless they're provided with extraordinary therapeutic measures. And thus, the fundamental inadequacies and non-functionalities of the New Haven hospice are brought out in its very assumptions and design, pointing to the roots for much bigger future calamities. Interestingly, the language surrounding the development of the New Haven hospice unconsciously reveals the meaninglessness and hidden symbolic meanings in the use of the terminology we often use in other contexts. For instance, the in-house morgue is referred to as the aftercare facility. And here's one of the dangerous disguises. In Montreal, they're setting up the palliative care unit, supposedly to counter our death-denying society. But by rightly focusing on death denial, people wrongly focus on the celebration of the deaths of old and severely disabled people. And I believe that the reality that death with dignity is not at all a real issue is strikingly borne out by the fact that there is vastly more eloquent advocacy for dignified death of elderly persons than for their dignified lives. Many people are decrying the nursing home situation, but there's almost no protest against the truly unbelievable, disguised, and absolutely massive disincentives in public law and funding against elderly people continuing to lead normal lives in their own homes. And compared to the preoccupation with death of the elderly, we see very little about the denial of dying of and among children, teenagers, young widowhood, death among young professors, what have you. If we see a book that says counseling the dying, what is the image that they show us? An old man. Not a child, not an athlete, an old man. To me, it sort of sounds as follows. Let's us humanists get together and talk about death, somebody else's death. The second babble and confusion of tongues is the presentation of euthanasia as good medical practice, maybe even as good science, which I've already alluded to. And so, a prominent leader of the new social biology movement recently said, the time has come for ethics to be removed temporarily from the hands of the philosophers and biologized. And that's verbatim, biologized. Because science is now in a position to answer the very origin and meaning of human values from which all ethical pronouncements and much of political action flow. And Dr. Alvarez wrote, it will probably be many years before we doctors in America can bring ourselves to chloroform an idiot infant or to permit a slowly dying patient to take an overdose of medicine. What we will first have to train ourselves to do will be to leave by the patient's bed a lethal drug, which he can take some night if he so desires. And then I read an article in the Beta Law Review, 1975, Euthanasia, medical treatment and the mongoloid child, death as a treatment of choice, ? And that, of course, will lead us to death therapy, a classical example of ultimate detoxification of death. And thirdly, the denial of value of the person, perhaps the value of life, perhaps the invocation of cost-benefit considerations. And so we hear the terms, meaningless lives, as in the Florida bill, lives devoid of value. Arguments have been advanced that cutting the incidence of Down syndrome by 50% would save nearly $1 billion a year, and you've heard the economic argument in Florida. Euthanasia of various kinds of people not only removes unpleasant realities which offend our hedonistic aesthetics, and not only removes inconvenient personal demands and social expenditures, it could also bring other important and very practical, even survival benefits to many people. And so a column in the recent April issue of The Futurist reports on a proposal advanced by Willard Galen, president of the Institute of Society, Ethics, and the Life Sciences, to cultivate living cadavers, or neomorts, both as a bank for body parts and organs and for the sake of experimentation. And neomorts would be people who have been declared dead because of cessation of brain waves, but whose bodies are still alive as a result of intensive medical maintenance. Such neomorts would be maintained in permanent hospitals or wards called bioemporiums. Again, a detoxification. They could serve as a ready source of blood and of all sorts of other body products which could be harvested. Since neomorts would still breathe and require feeding and excrete and etc., they could increase even further in utility if death could be redefined as taking place not merely at the cessation of brain functioning, but more narrowly at the cessation of cortical functioning. Medical students could practice profitably on such neomorts, who could be made to undergo various diseases so as to challenge the diagnostic skills of the young practitioner. And they would offer particularly promising practicum experiences for more difficult medical procedures, such as spinal taps and certain types of surgery. Trial drugs could be administered for intermediate trials between animal experiments and medical application to human beings, living humans, I should say. Among the many benefits cited in the report would be the reduction of the necessity to utilize live patients as guinea pigs. And fourthly will come the denial of humanity itself. And of course, that has a long history that most of you are thoroughly familiar with. And I will not review the history of our own association, when people were denied, retarded people, their humanity in the genetic scare era and so on. But we hear phrases today about so-called human beings below the animal level of functioning. A new book only 3 years ago, based on a doctoral dissertation, claimed to have proven that the profoundly retarded are not human because they do not possess culture. Again, the old argument, they are a different species. Nobel Prize winner James Watson called for a waiting period of 3 days before a newborn would be declared alive. Bringing about the death of the infant would thus not be illegal. Other people have even called and are calling for a whole year to go by before we acknowledge the humanity of an infant. The first such suggestions were in jest. Now they are seriously proposed. In fact, you might say, that seriously. And so Professor Williams, University of Washington Medical School, says, even the full-term infant must undergo many changes before attaining full status of humanity. Only near the end of the first year of age does a child demonstrate intellectual development, speaking ability, and other attributes that differentiate him significantly from other species. And then we come to Dr. Joseph Fletcher, who has written extensively and spoken extensively, and who has compiled his index of indicators of humanhood. Well, what are the indicators of humanhood according to Dr. Fletcher? Well, IQ 40, you are questionably a person. IQ 20 or below, you are not a person. You must have self-awareness, a sense of time, a sense of futurity, the capability to relate to others, concern for others, communication, control of existence, curiosity, changeable and not opposed to change, balance of rationality and feelings, idiosyncrasy, and neocortical functioning. And you must have these to be a human person. I know an awful lot of people, including people with doctorates and professors, who would not pass. And I know human service leaders and politicians. A sense of futurity, changeable and not opposed to change, a balance of rationality and feelings, concern for others. Fletcher's definition is a license to kill. And yet I'm not sure that more retarded than non-retarded people might not pass this test. And so a mother wrote, Mrs. Green, wake up and see what you have done. You have had your baby a very fine son. Mrs. Brown, wake up and see what you have done. Your little girl's life has just begun. We'll take them now and swaddle them in white and off to the nursery to start a new life. Mrs. Blue, wake up and see what you have done. You have birthed a Down syndrome child, a son. What do you want us to do, Mrs. Blue? Surely you don't want us to give it to you. We'll take him away to the nursery now, and we'll swaddle him in a shroud. Of course, we may encounter these 4 types of rationalizations not only singly, but in various combinations. For instance, the author of Freedom to Die has suggested a euthanasia bill requiring 2 physicians to certify that there is, quotes, no reasonable chance for a significant recovery, usefulness, or happiness. And that lays an awful burden on happiness when even the framers of our constitutions only promise us its pursuit and not its attainment. Death-making will become so detoxified, and this is one of my predictions, death-making will become so detoxified that many citizens will hardly be aware of its pervasiveness in our society. It will be analogous to the horrors in our nursing homes, which are taking place today, perhaps in the hearts of busy neighborhoods, with traffic and people going back and forth, because there are all the trappings of medicine, of humanism, of academicism, of science, and of good business management. And all of these will disguise and are disguising a systematized brutalization of a huge number of our citizenry. I recently spent about 1/2 hour alone in a room with a profoundly retarded young man. The man was lying in the bed, his body contorted, wrapped in a diaper. He was completely helpless, non-ambulatory. He had to be fed by hand. His face was coarse, indeed ugly. He was unshaven, he drooled, he could not speak a word, nor could he understand one. And I must admit that I could not recall being a combination of alone, number one, for a period of time in a room with an adult who was this handicapped and this unattractive, and meditated on this phenomenon. And I thought I glimpsed a part of our future. And I perceived at this moment of meditation that increasingly in our culture there would not exist a value base that would enable a great many people to relate to this man in any fashion that would give them, the workers, meaning. And as a result, there would be no place in the world for people such as him. And the remnant of those who did see meaning in the life of such a person would be further reduced by the number of those, or to the number of those who would be prepared to take radical action to protect such lives. Some might see the meaning, but only some of them would take radical action. And they might find that they might have to take refuge in social castles to protect the helpless from the culture that would gladly kill them. Already, fellow members of this association, already it is no longer safe for severely handicapped people to be treated in generic hospitals today, in this country and in Canada. In Syracuse, a 63-year-old resident of the state institution was normalizedly admitted to a general hospital where she died after her life supports were withdrawn. The issue here was not even so much the withdrawal of supports, which perhaps was justified, but how these supports were withdrawn. It was a secret medical decision somewhere in the back corridors of medical power, and any attempt to consult relatives or friends, or even those actually responsible by law in the institution for her, the officials, did not take place. And also, the major argument advanced later was that she would never be happy anyway. And there again is the happiness argument. Similarly, in Toronto, one of the most valued members of a group home community had to be guarded 24 hours a day in a general hospital to assure that even normative hospital services would not be withdrawn, to prevent the withdrawal of normative basic supports. And people are telling me increasingly of an increasing frequency of such events elsewhere. We are even at the point where it is not just the profoundly and the severely retarded, increasingly already moderately retarded people are classed in the minds of many people as being so severely handicapped as to be equated with severely and profoundly retarded people for whom such euthanasia is seen as justified. So we're at the point where we need guards for retarded people in general hospitals. The sad day may come when generic nursing homes will be death traps, even more for the mentally retarded than for the elderly, and where the old traditional institution may emerge or survive as one of the safer shelters. While the latter is a mere speculation, I will now, and I'm almost done, I will now predict, and I will predict strongly. Number one, that there will be a drastic increase in discussion, debate, symposia, papers, and so on this issue, not only in society but in this association. And secondly, that the membership of this association will become deeply divided on this issue. And I consider it not at all far-fetched that it is this issue that may split this association far asunder. It should not be forgotten, if you think that this is far-fetched, it should not be forgotten that it has been exhaustively documented that during the genetic alarm period, not a single leader of our association took a radical public advocacy stance on behalf of the mentally retarded. A radical and public. Private, I do not know. But I searched the literature, I could not find one single radical advocacy stance on behalf of retarded people during the genetic scare period from our leaders, with but perhaps one apparent exception. With that exception, which I come to in a moment, our leaders allied themselves with what they perceive to be the interests of society, not of the retarded. And a full 25 of our past presidents during this period, starting less than 10 years after our founding, and lasting into 1930, 45, almost 50 years, most vigorously joined the indictment which resulted in such horrors. Several of these 25, even then, implicitly or explicitly called for the death of retarded people. You can see the list of our presidents facing page 1 of our program. And in my extensive searches, I could find only one leadership voice publicly recorded in minutes, in articles or books, in which I could read some compassion with the retarded, some reluctance to grant the validity of the indictment, perhaps much deeper reservations than actually was expressed publicly. And I thought I read that in Edward R. Johnstone, who was our president in 1903 and 04, and again in 1927 1928. In essence, then, I'm saying that in our society we can perceive massive dynamics of decay and dissolution, with dire implications to many retarded people. These consequences may not occur, but if they do not occur, it will not merely be due to the fact that we don't like to contemplate such unpleasant thoughts. Too many people are inclined to wish away what is too unpleasant, much as almost our entire society is pretending that many problems, the energy crisis, nuclear proliferation and so on, will just simply go away and take care of itself. Are there then any signs of hope? I see a few, but not many, and I see none that will offset the powerful dynamics of destruction. One reason I see so few counter-dynamics is that systems building, after all, is such a complex, long-term, agonizing undertaking that requires individual self-denial. It requires de-individualization and self-denial, while the overpowering lure of hedonism is short-term gratification. Anybody can burn and shoot, get a kick out of it. But few can get a kick out of the long, drawn-out, long-term process and agonies of systems building. Oddly enough, hedonism, especially via individualism, is having a positive fallout for the more mildly retarded. The more mildly retarded, because of the liberation of individualism. It has resulted in greater acceptance of diversity and in pluralism. However, this advantage is offset by disadvantages, of course, when it comes to the severely handicapped. Two routes of hope are, unfortunately, two-edged swords and perhaps even perverse. One is that it is quite possible that our society will simply collapse before active euthanasia is legalized or widely practiced. And it will not come to that. The second is that perhaps after it becomes legalized and widely practiced, it will lead to such excesses, and I do believe that if it becomes legalized, it will lead to such excesses that people will draw eventually back in recognition and horror and reverse what they have done. An unequivocally positive sign is that it is extremely unlikely that the mentally retarded will ever again be as totally abandoned by members of this association as they were by our members during the genetic scare period. And another and related, modest, and by far the most joyful sign of hope is the fact that a small number of people, and an increasing number of people, are establishing intimate communities, which often include not merely retarded but severely retarded persons. These may be citizen advocacy type relationships, they may be residential communities, such as L'Arche, Campbell, and others. These may be intimate group homes, and so on. When our society collapses, I fear that only the retarded people who are part of intimate communities may survive. Intimate communities especially, in which 1/2 or more of the members are not retarded. I also see the distinct possibility that citizens who may be trying to take active steps that are consistent with radically life-defensive moral values in order to save the lives of impaired persons may find themselves in conflict with the state and with the law. For instance, a person such as a nurse who witnessed the 2-week starvation of the infant with Down syndrome at Johns Hopkins University might very well decide to grab the baby and run, to save the child's life, perhaps to raise the child via an underground network of like-minded people. That is very, very, very conceivable to me. In this and similar fashion, however, people with deep values opposed to killing may be confronted with excruciating choices, perhaps in a fashion translated to our day-to-day, not dissimilar to the choices confronted by many people at many times in history. For example, the conquered Jews in the book of Maccabees, where their choice was to indulge yourself, eat savory pork, or adore the graven image of the false god, or to keep alive the faith and to be burned. Or indulge in the easy comforts and morality of our hedonistic culture, or defend the lives of the lowly and be martyred.
For the conclusion of this presentation, please turn your cassette over.
I am surprised that such confrontations between the state and some radical souls has not yet happened. And I would be even more surprised and more pessimistic if it didn't happen in the future.
Ladies and gentlemen, I present Mr. Jan O'Brien, Deputy Director of the Georgia Mental Health Institute.
Most of my reactions to this can't be spoken at this point. I don't have words for them. When I was little, I knew that everything was going to be all right because my father told me that it would. And he told me that there was nothing in the dark that would hurt me. And when he thought that I had grown up, he began to show me that not all the dark would hurt me, but that some of the dark was cold, and that there were things that would hurt, and that there were things that were far beyond my control. My own response to this tonight is that it's painful to hear, that it's confusing, that I don't know what to think yet, that I don't know what to think well enough to know whether I agree or whether I disagree. But I am grateful. I'm grateful for the vision and for the courage to speak it. I'm grateful for being treated as though I am a grown-up, as though I can be told some of the things that a deep meditation, that deep thought on the facts of our cultural life at the moment offer us. I'm grateful because I feel like this is better than self-congratulation.
This is better than talking about how we've got it made. This is better than celebrating the victories that we have won. Better than sterile, happy fairy tales with no heart and no guts. Better than being reassured that I have control when in fact we may not. And there are several responses I think that we might have to this. We might shoot the messenger. We might simply dismiss this as craziness. We might dismiss it as something that's too depressing to think about. We might depress it as one-sided. We might set it aside as too narrow a perspective. On the other hand, we might nod and say that's true. All those people out there really are caught up in a hedonistic society, and things ought to be better. On the other hand, and finally, we might greet this vision, we might greet these words with silence, with some time for reflection, as an opportunity to come better into contact with some of the realities that shape our world, our services, our careers, the lives of those whom we serve. We might, out of silence and reflection, come to some kind of a basis for finding other people with whom to try to achieve more clarity of thought, of language, and of action on these issues. And if we shoot the messenger, and if we disregard or see this as something that's happening out there with them, then that will make this almost too painful for me to hear. But if we can find a way to use what we've heard to build a clearer vision and to struggle more strongly with others, then perhaps this dark is light enough.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien and Dr. Wolfensberger. On behalf of all those assembled here, we thank you. The meeting is adjourned.